My name is Evelyn Wells, and for 28 years, I was the ghost at my family's feast. I was the shadow that proved how brightly my sister, Clara, shone. They had crafted this role for me with such meticulous care that I had almost come to believe it myself. But belief is a fragile thing, and on the day of my sister's wedding, under the weight of 1,000 crystal teardrops hanging from ballroom chandeliers, it was about to be shattered. I stood near the back of the grand hall, a solitary figure in a simple navy blue dress that was modest, respectable, and in this sea of extravagant pastels and shimmering silks, utterly invisible. It was the perfect camouflage. From my vantage point, I watched my parents, Richard and Alina Wells, glide through the crowd. They were masters of their universe, a world built on strategic alliances and the currency of appearances. My father, a man whose ambition had always outstripped his achievements in the corporate world, wore his tailored suit like armor. My mother, a woman who saw her children not as daughters, but as extensions of her own social legacy, was a vision in champagne lace, her smile as dazzling and hard as the diamonds at her throat. This event, the union of their prized daughter Clara to the scion of a manufacturing empire, Marcus Thorne, was their magnum opus. It was the culmination of a lifetime of careful social climbing, and they were soaking in the glory. As I watched them, a waiter offered me a glass of champagne. I took it, the delicate fizz a stark contrast to the leaden feeling in my stomach. The humiliation had begun the moment I arrived. There was no warm embrace, no Evelyn, we're so glad you could make it. Instead, my mother's eyes had swept over me, her lips tightening in a familiar moue of disapproval. "Evelyn, darling," she'd said, her voice a silken weapon, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "That dress is very practical. Did you come straight from the office?" I didn't have an office, not in the way she understood. The sting of her words was an old, familiar pain, a phantom limb of familial affection that ached with every passive-aggressive jab. My father had simply clapped me on the shoulder, his touch fleeting and insubstantial. "Good of you to show up, Evie," he'd mumbled, his eyes already scanning the room for someone more important to talk to. They had seated me at the furthest table from the bridal party, a collection of distant cousins and Marcus's socially awkward business associates. Table 19, the land of misfit toys. It was a deliberate, calculated slight, a public declaration of my status in the family hierarchy, present but not accounted for. I took a slow sip of champagne, the cool liquid doing nothing to soothe the burning in my chest. They thought they knew me. They saw a quiet, unassuming woman who had chosen a strange, unfeminine career out of a lack of better options. They saw failure. They saw a daughter who had stubbornly refused to fit into the mold they had so carefully prepared for her. They had no idea who I was. They had no idea what I was capable of. And as the orchestra swelled, signaling the beginning of the wedding speeches, I straightened my spine. The ghost was about to step into the light. The ceremony had been an ethereal affair, held in a garden where roses climbed ancient stone walls, and the air was thick with the scent of lilies and entitlement. Clara, a vision in white, had glided down the aisle on my father's arm, her smile radiant, her eyes fixed on the fortune that awaited her at the altar. I had watched from the back pew, an observer at a pageant I had no part in. My mind had drifted back to a dozen other moments just like this one, moments where I was on the periphery, watching Clara's life unfold in a series of perfectly curated triumphs. Her first ballet recital, her graduation from a prestigious art school, the gallery opening for her first curated exhibit. At each event, I was the quiet sister in the background, the one whose own achievements were met with a dismissive wave. When I graduated from the Naval Academy, my parents had attended the ceremony, their expressions a mixture of confusion and mild embarrassment. "Well, at least it's a stable job," my father had said, as if I'd just been hired as a mid-level accountant. They never asked about my training, my deployments, or the immense responsibility I carried. To them, my life was an abstract concept, a strange and slightly grubby detour from the path a proper woman should take. They didn't understand the call of the sea, the profound sense of purpose I found in service, the quiet, unshakable confidence that came from knowing you were part of something larger than yourself. They only understood what they could see, what they could boast about at their country club dinners. A daughter who curated art exhibits for the city's elite, that was a status symbol. A daughter who commanded a vessel in hostile waters, That was an eye. Inconvenient secret, a detail to be glossed over. Now, at the reception, the air crackled with false cheer. I navigated the crowded room, my years of training allowing me to move with a quiet efficiency that went unnoticed. I felt a pang of loneliness, a deep, resonant ache for a family I wished I had, one that would see me, truly see me, and be proud. I found my seat at table 19, the social Siberia of the event. The other occupants were polite but preoccupied. I was invisible, and for a moment I was grateful for it. From my remote outpost, I could observe the entire battlefield. I watched Clara and Marcus make their grand entrance, a golden couple bathed in the adoring glow of the spotlights. I watched my mother bask in the reflected glory, her laughter a little too loud, her gestures a little too grand. She was performing, and the audience was rapt. At the head table, amongst the groom's family, sat an elderly man I didn't recognize. He was tall and lean, with a shock of white hair and a face that looked as though it had been carved from granite. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, but it was the decorations on his lapel that caught my eye, a subtle display of military honors that spoke of a long and distinguished career. He sat with a quiet stillness, his gaze sweeping the room with an unnerving intensity. He wasn't participating in the frivolous chatter around him. He was assessing, observing. For a fleeting moment, his eyes met mine across the crowded room. There was no flicker of recognition, but for an instant I felt seen. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, like being caught in the beam of a searchlight. I quickly looked away, focusing on the intricate patterns of the silverware on my table. The speeches were about to begin. The real performance was about to start. The clinking of a spoon against a crystal glass silenced the room. My father, Richard Wells, stood at the podium, his chest puffed out with pride. He beamed at the crowd, a benevolent king surveying his loyal subjects. "Friends, family," he began, his voice booming with practiced charisma. "What a day, what a glorious day." He launched into a lengthy, saccharine tribute to Clara, painting a picture of a perfect daughter who had never caused a moment of worry, a creative genius, a beautiful soul who had found her perfect match in Marcus. He recounted anecdotes from her childhood, the finger paintings that showed her early artistic promise, the time she won the school's spelling bee, the way she had always lit up a room with her presence. Each word was a carefully polished stone, building a monument to his favored child. I listened, my expression neutral, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I had learned long ago how to compartmentalize this kind of pain. In my world, emotion was a luxury you couldn't afford in a crisis. You locked it away, dealt with the threat, and only then in the quiet aftermath did you allow yourself to feel. This was a different kind of crisis, a slow, emotional bleed, but the principle was the same. Stay calm, observe, assess. "I always knew Clara was destined for great things," my father continued, his voice thick with emotion. "She has a fire in her, a passion for beauty and life that is truly rare." He paused, taking a sip of water, letting the sentiment hang in the air. Then his eyes flickered in my direction, a brief, almost imperceptible glance. "Of course," he said with a dismissive chuckle, "not all paths are as clear. Some of us take the scenic route." A few sycophantic guests chuckled along with him. The barb was aimed at me, a subtle but unmistakable dismissal of my life's work. The scenic route. That's what he called years of grueling training, of sleepless nights on watch, of leading sailors through treacherous waters, of making life-or-death decisions in the blink of an eye. To him, it was just a quirky, unimportant detour. I kept my gaze fixed on him, my face a mask of polite indifference. Inside, the old wounds tore open. I remembered the day I told him I had been accepted into the academy. He had looked at me not with pride, but with a kind of weary disappointment. "The military, Evelyn, really? Is this some kind of phase? You know, it's not too late to get a business degree." He had wanted a daughter who would marry well and produce beautiful grandchildren, a daughter who would be a credit to him on the golf course. He had gotten Clara, and he had gotten me. He finished his speech with a toast to the happy couple, and the room erupted in applause. He returned to his seat, glowing with self-satisfaction, completely oblivious to the blade he had just twisted in my heart. He didn't see me as a person, only as a reflection of himself. And because my reflection was not the one he wanted to see, he had deemed it worthless. The quiet man with the military decorations, I noticed, had not applauded. He had simply watched my father with a cool, unreadable expression. His gaze then shifted back to me, and this time it lingered for a moment longer. It was not a look of pity, but of something else. something that felt disturbingly like recognition. The applause faded, and my mother, Alina, rose to her feet. If my father's speech was a monument, hers was a masterpiece of social assassination, delivered with a smile. She was a virtuoso of the veiled insult, the backhanded compliment, the public declaration of affection that was, in reality, a display of power. "Richard, darling, you've left me with nothing to say," she began, her voice a melodious purr that carried to every corner of the room. "You've captured our Clara perfectly." She spoke of Clara's grace, her impeccable taste, her brilliant match with Marcus. She presented her daughter as a work of art she herself had sculpted and polished for the world to admire. The room hung on her every word. Alina Wells was in her element, the queen of her court, the architect of this perfect day. Then she turned her attention, and the attention of all her guests, toward the back of the room, toward me. "And of course," she said, her smile widening, "we are so happy that our Evelyn could be here with us today." The words were sweet, but the tone was laced with condescension. She made it sound as if my presence were a rare and surprising treat, as if I had emerged from some dark, forgotten corner of the world just for this occasion. It's not often she can get away from from her duties. She paused, letting the ambiguity hang in the air, inviting the guests to fill in the blanks with their own dismissive assumptions. A government clerk, a uniformed functionary of some kind. The possibilities were endless and, in this context, all equally unimpressive. I felt hundreds of pairs of eyes turned towards me. I was on display, the family's strange little secret, brought out for a moment of public inspection. I held my breath, my training kicking in. Do not react. Do not show weakness. My mother wasn't finished. She looked directly at me, her eyes glittering with a cold, triumphant light. She raised her glass. "We weren't sure she'd be able to make it. Her life is so different from ours. No galas, no gallery openings, just a very simple, structured existence. But she's here." The feigned enthusiasm was sickening. And then came the final, devastating blow. A woman at a nearby table, one of my mother's closest confidants, leaned in and whispered something to her. My mother laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that cut through the air. She covered her mouth with her hand in a gesture of mock surprise, but her eyes danced with malice. She lowered her voice just enough to make it seem like a shared secret, but in the suddenly silent room, her words carried with perfect clarity. "SHES nothing, Mom SNEERED," quoting her friend with a conspiratorial wink. The phrase hung in the air, stark and brutal. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through the room. It wasn't a roar, it was worse. It was a titter of complicity, the sound of people who were all too happy to laugh at the expense of someone they didn't know, to affirm the social order my mother had established. They laughed at the quiet girl in the plain dress at the back table. They laughed at the family disappointment. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls around my heart crumbled. The pain was no longer a dull ache, it was a white-hot agony. My own mother, in front of everyone, had just declared me a nonentity. A zero. Nothing. My face remained impassive, but inside I was free-falling. The room began to spin, the faces of the laughing guests blurring into a grotesque tapestry of mockery. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to run. But I was frozen in my chair, pinned down by the weight of their scorn. The laughter sputtered and died, leaving behind a profound and ringing silence. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the unspoken cruelty of what had just happened. My mother, realizing perhaps that she had gone too far, tried to recover with a flimsy, "Oh, I'm just teasing." But the damage was done. The ugliness of the moment lingered, a stain on the pristine perfection of the wedding. I sat perfectly still, my gaze fixed on the white tablecloth, my hands clenched into tight fists under the table. I could feel the heat of 100 stares on me, a mixture of pity, curiosity, and contempt. This was it. This was the moment I would carry with me forever, the definitive proof of my place in this family. I was nothing. And then a sound, the scrape of a chair against the polished floor. It was a small sound, but in the dead silence, it was as loud as a thunderclap. Slowly, I lifted my head. Across the room, the tall, white-haired man with the military decorations was getting to his feet. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace that commanded attention. Every eye in the room swiveled to him. Who was this man, daring to interrupt the carefully orchestrated proceedings? He was T of the groom's family, a distant figure most people had ignored. Now he was the center of the universe. My parents stared at him, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and confusion. Clara and Marcus looked on, bewildered. The man ignored them all. His gaze was fixed on me and only me. He began to walk, not toward the head table, not toward the podium, but directly toward table 19. His steps were measured and silent on the thick carpet. With each step he took, the tension in the room coiled tighter. The guests held their breath, a collective sense of anticipation and dread filling the air. He was a ship of the line, cutting a path through a sea of startled yachts. He passed my parents' table without a glance. He walked past the bride and groom as if they were statues in a museum. His focus was singular, his purpose absolute. He was coming for me. My heart hammered against my ribs. What was happening? Who was this man? I had never seen him before in my life. He reached my table and stopped. He stood before me, a towering figure of quiet authority. The medals on his chest seemed to catch and hold all the light in the room. He looked down at me, and his eyes, which had seemed so cold and assessing from a distance, were now filled with a warmth and respect that I had never seen from anyone in my family. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a living thing, pressing in on all of us. Then he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it resonated with a power that filled the entire hall. It was a voice accustomed to command, a voice that expected and received instant obedience. "Captain Wells," he said, the words clear and precise, "it is an honor to see you again." He extended his hand. Time seemed to stop. The name echoed in the silence. Captain, not Evelyn, not Evie, Captain Wells. It was a title, a rank, a statement of fact that completely contradicted the narrative my mother had just so cruelly established. I stared at his outstretched hand, my mind struggling to process what was happening. Slowly, as if in a dream, I rose to my feet. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. All the air had been sucked out of it. I placed my hand in his. His grip was firm, steady, a rock in the turbulent sea of my emotions. The man, who I now knew must be a very senior officer, did not release my hand. Instead, he held it, turning slightly to face the stunned and silent room, making it clear that we were a united front. "For those of you who do not know," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "this is Captain Evelyn Wells." He paused, letting the title sink in, letting it work its way through the layers of prejudice and ignorance in the room. He then looked directly at my parents, his gaze as cold and hard as steel. "A title, I might add, that is earned through courage, sacrifice, and leadership. Not inherited, not bought, earned." My mother's face had gone chalky white. The smug, triumphant smile was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of utter disbelief. My father looked as if he had been struck by lightning. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The Admiral, for he could be nothing less, was not finished. He turned his attention back to me, his expression softening slightly. "Captain Wells," he said, his voice now a little quieter, more personal, but still audible to the hushed crowd. "The fleet needs you. Your new assignment has been confirmed. You'll be taking command of the Dauntless," a fitting name for its new captain. The Dauntless, one of the most advanced destroyers in the fleet, a command position of immense prestige and responsibility, one that was given only to the best of the best. It was news he was clearly not supposed to be sharing in this venue, but he had made a calculated decision. He had seen an injustice and he was correcting it, using the full weight of his authority to do so. A gasp went through the room. This wasn't some minor administrative role. This was real. This was serious. This was power. And then the defining sound of the evening. The sharp, shattering crack of crystal against marble. My father, Richard Wells, had dropped his champagne glass. It exploded on the floor, the sound echoing the implosion of his carefully constructed world. His face was a mask of horror, not just at the public humiliation, but at the dawning, sickening realization of his own monumental ignorance. He had a daughter who was a hero, a leader, a captain in the United States Navy, and he had treated her like a footnote. Clara, the radiant bride, was no longer radiant. She was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a dawning, bitter jealousy. Her perfect day, her moment in the spotlight, had been completely and irrevocably upstaged. The ghost at the feast had just become the guest of honor, and the queen of the ball had been rendered a mere spectator. My mother, Alina, finally seemed to find her voice. "Admiral," she stammered, the name a guess, a desperate attempt to grasp the situation. "There must be some mistake. Our Evelyn. She couldn't finish the sentence. What could she say? Our Evelyn, who we thought was nothing. The Admiral's gaze swiveled back to her, and it was utterly unforgiving. "There is no mistake, madam," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "The mistake was yours." The Admiral's words hung in the air, a final, damning verdict. The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer just the absence of noise, it was the presence of judgment. The guests, who had so eagerly laughed at my expense just moments before, now stared at my family with a mixture of awe and contempt. The whispers started, quiet at first, then growing in volume, a rising tide of speculation and reassessment. A captain! The Dauntless! Isn't that one of the new Aegis destroyers? Did you hear what he called her? Her family had no idea. The social currency my parents had spent a lifetime accumulating was going up in flames. They had built their reputation on a foundation of perceived class and influence, and that foundation was now crumbling into dust. The Admiral had not just revealed my identity, he had exposed theirs. He had shown them to be small, petty, and profoundly ignorant people, blind to the true worth of their own daughter. Richard, my father, was the first to try and salvage the situation. He scrambled to his feet, dabbing at the champagne stain on his trousers with a napkin, a pathetic, fumbling gesture. He approached us, his face a grotesque mask of forced geniality. "Admiral," he boomed, his voice cracking slightly. "Admiral Thorne, of course, Marcus's godfather. What a delightful surprise. You know, our Evelyn." He was trying to reclaim the narrative, to position himself as a proud father who was just in on the joke. The attempt was so transparent, so clumsy, that it was painful to watch. Admiral Thorne did not deign to look at him. He kept his focus on me, his grip on my hand a reassuring anchor. "I know Captain Wells," he corrected, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. "A finer officer I have not had the privilege to serve with. Her file reads like a novel of heroism. I'm not sure I recognize the person you and your wife were describing earlier." The rebuke was surgical, precise, and utterly devastating. It cut through my father's bluster and left him speechless, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. He had been dismissed, not by a social rival, but by a man whose authority was absolute and unquestionable. Next came my mother. Eleanor, ever the performer, tried a different tactic. She glided towards us, her face arranged in an expression of tearful maternal pride. "Oh, Evelyn, darling," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Why didn't you tell us? We're so proud. We were just having a little fun, you know how families are." She reached out to touch my arm, to draw me into her circle of deceit. I took a small step back, a subtle but clear rejection of her advance. For the first time in my life, I did not yield. I did not shrink. I did not try to smooth things over. I simply stood my ground, my hand still held firmly by the Admiral. The Admiral answered for me. "Madam," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "I have been in rooms where diplomats decide the fates of nations. I have witnessed tense negotiations under the threat of open war. I have never in all my years witnessed a display of such calculated cruelty directed by a mother towards her own child. That was not fun. That was a disgrace." The word disgrace landed like a physical blow. Eleanor recoiled as if she had been slapped. The mask of the gracious hostess shattered, revealing the raw, ugly panic beneath. She looked around desperately, seeking an ally, but found only the cold, judging eyes of her guests. The social universe she had so carefully constructed had turned against her. The Queen had been deposed in her own court. The Admiral, having delivered his final salvo, turned to me. "Captain," he said, his voice now gentle, "I believe we are no longer required here. Would you permit me to escort you out?" It was a lifeline, an offer of escape from this toxic battlefield. A part of me, the part that had been wounded and humiliated for years, wanted to stay. It wanted to watch them squirm. It wanted to savor the victory, to see the full extent of the social wreckage. But as I looked at my family, my father red-faced and sputtering, my mother pale and trembling, my sister her perfect day in ruins, I felt no triumph, only a deep, profound sadness, a hollow ache for what could have been, for the family I never had. Vengeance was a bitter, unsatisfying meal. What I wanted was peace. What I wanted was respect. And I had that now, not from them, but from myself and from the world I had chosen. "Yes, Admiral," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I would be honored." I looked at Clara one last time. Her eyes were filled with a confusing mixture of anger and a dawning, terrible understanding. In that moment, I think she finally saw me, not as her dowdy, unsuccessful sister, but as a woman of substance and power, a woman who had built a life of meaning far away from the shallow world she inhabited. There was no apology in her eyes, only the bitter sting of a rivalry she hadn't even known she was losing. I gave a small, polite nod to Marcus's parents, who were watching me with expressions of stunned respect. Then, with the Admiral at my side, I turned my back on my family and walked away. We moved through the parted crowd like a ship through water. The whispers followed us, a wake of awe and disbelief. Did you see their faces? I can't believe they didn't know. She's a captain, a real one. As we walked through the grand lobby and out into the cool night air, I felt a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying lift from my shoulders. It was the weight of their expectations, their disapproval, their carefully constructed narrative of my failure. I had been carrying it for 28 years, and now, finally, I was free. The Admiral's driver was waiting with a black town car. He opened the door for me, and I slid into the plush leather seat. The Admiral got in beside me. As the car pulled away from the curb, leaving the glittering facade of the reception hall behind, I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for my entire life. The silence in the car was comfortable, companionable. "Admiral Thorne," I said finally, turning to the man who had so dramatically altered the course of my evening and perhaps my life. "I don't know how to thank you." He looked at me, a faint, rare smile touching the corners of his mouth. "There's no need for thanks, Captain," he said. "Honor is not a privilege, it's a duty. I saw a fellow officer being dishonored. It was my duty to correct the record." He then explained that he had known my grandfather, a decorated naval aviator from the Vietnam era, and had followed my career with quiet interest out of respect for his old friend. He had seen my name on the promotion lists, had read the commendations in my file. He knew exactly who I was long before he ever walked into that room. "Your family's ignorance is their loss, Captain," he said, his voice firm. "Not your burden to bear. The Navy is your family now. We see you. We value you." Never forget that. The simple, profound truth of his words washed over me, a healing balm on a lifetime of wounds. He was right. I had been searching for acceptance in a place that was incapable of giving it. My true family was the one I had chosen, the one I had earned my place in through sweat, dedication, and honor, the one that called me captain. Back at the wedding, the party was over. The music had stopped, but the guests lingered, clustered in small groups, whispering excitedly. The spectacular implosion of the Wells family was far more entertaining than any band or champagne fountain. The groom, Marcus, was furious. He confronted Clara and her parents in a small antechamber, his voice a low, controlled hiss of rage. "What was that?" he demanded. "You invited a 4-star admiral, a man my family deeply respects, and you allowed your petty family drama to insult him and his colleague. Do you have any idea how that makes us look?" Eleanor, still reeling, tried to defend herself. "We didn't know. How were we supposed to know? She never tells us anything." "Perhaps because you never listen," Marcus shot back, his patience gone. "Perhaps because you were too busy mocking her to ever ask a single meaningful question about her life. You didn't just humiliate Evelyn tonight. You humiliated me. You humiliated my family. You turned my wedding into a public spectacle of your own cruelty and ignorance." Richard, blustering and defensive, tried to intervene. "Now see here, Marcus, that's no way to talk to your new mother-in-law." "Don't you dare," Marcus cut him off, his eyes flashing with fury. "You stood up there and belittled your own daughter in front of 200 people. You have no right to lecture me on anything." Clara, who had been silent until now, finally broke. "She ruined my wedding." She cried, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "She did this on purpose. She's always been jealous of me." Marcus just stared at her, his expression hardening from anger to a kind of cold, dawning pity. "She didn't do anything, Clara," he said quietly. "She just sat there while your mother called her nothing." The Admiral is the one who stood up. And you know why? Because Evelyn has something you and your parents will never understand. She has character. She has earned her place in the world. She doesn't need a fancy wedding or a rich husband to validate her existence. The truth of his words hit Clara harder than any insult. She sank into a chair, her sobs now quiet and despairing. The dream was over. Her perfect day was a catastrophe. The foundation of her world, the belief in her own inherent superiority, had been shattered. She had spent her whole life as the sun in her family's solar system, and she had just discovered that the quiet, distant planet she had always ignored was, in fact, a star of far greater magnitude. The fallout was swift and brutal. The story of the Admiral and the captain spread through their social circle like wildfire. The Wells family, who had prided themselves on their impeccable reputation, became a cautionary tale, a subject of gossip and ridicule. Their friends, who had been so quick to laugh with them, were now just as quick to laugh at them. They had committed the ultimate social sin. They had been exposed as frauds. Their carefully curated image of class and sophistication had been stripped away, revealing the ugly pettiness beneath. In the days that followed, the calls began. The first was from my father. His voice was strained, a pathetic attempt at the paternal authority he had long since forfeited. "Evelyn," he began, "about the other night. Your mother and I, it was a misunderstanding." I didn't say anything. I just let him talk, let him stumble over his own inadequate excuses. There was no real apology, just a desperate attempt to smooth things over, to put the genie back in the bottle. He was concerned not about my feelings, but about the damage to his reputation. "Admiral Thorne," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "is a very important man. We wouldn't want this awkwardness to affect our family's standing." "There is no us, Dad," I said finally, my voice calm and devoid of anger. It was a simple statement of fact. "There is you, Mom and Clara, and there is me. You made that very clear." I could hear his sharp intake of breath. He tried to argue, to bluster, but the words died in his throat. He knew I was right. I ended the call politely but firmly. I was not a problem to be managed. I was a daughter he had lost. The next call was from my mother. She was crying, a storm of theatrical sobs designed to elicit my sympathy. "Evelyn, my darling, my baby, I am so sorry," she wept. "I don't know what came over me. You know I love you. How could you think I didn't?" Her words were a familiar script, a manipulative performance I had seen 100 times before. But this time, it had no effect on me. I was no longer in the audience. I was the director of my own life. "I don't think you're a bad person, Mom," I said, and I meant it. "I just think you value the opinions of strangers more than you value the happiness of your own daughter. I can't live like that anymore." I told her I needed space, that I couldn't be the person she wanted me to be. Her sobs turned to accusations, her grief to anger. She called me ungrateful, cold, cruel. It was the last-ditch effort of a puppeteer whose strings had just been cut. I listened, and then I said goodbye. Clara sent a text message, a long, rambling paragraph that was part apology, part accusation. "I'm sorry for how Mom and Dad treated you," she wrote. "But you could have handled it differently. You ruined my wedding. You made everything about you." I read the message and felt a final, weary sadness. She still didn't get it. She never would. I deleted the text without replying. I was done. I was not angry. I was not bitter. I was simply finished. The power they had held over me for so long was gone, not because I had taken it from them, but because I had simply walked away from it. I had my own life, my own purpose, my own family and the men and women I served with. I didn't need their approval anymore. I had my own. A few months passed. I was immersed in preparations for my new command, a daunting and exhilarating task that consumed all my time and energy. The drama of the wedding faded into the background, a distant memory that no longer had the power to hurt me. One day, a thick envelope arrived at my temporary quarters. It had no return address, but I recognized the spidery, hesitant handwriting. It was from my father. I almost threw it away, but something made me pause. I opened it. Inside was not a long, rambling letter of excuses, but a single sheet of paper. The letter was short, the sentences stilted and awkward, as if they had been written by a man who was unaccustomed to expressing genuine emotion. He didn't apologize for what happened at the wedding. Instead, he wrote about his own father, my grandfather, the naval aviator Admiral Thorne had mentioned. He wrote about how his father had been a hero, a man of quiet strength and unwavering principle, and how he, Richard, had always felt like he was living in his shadow. He had gone into business, chased money and status, trying to build a different kind of legacy, but he had always felt like he was coming up short. "I never understood your path," he wrote. "It was so different from the world I knew. I thought it was a rejection of me, of everything I had tried to build. See now that it wasn't about me at all. It was about you. You are more like him than I ever was." He had enclosed an old, faded photograph. It was a picture of my grandfather, a young man in his flight suit, standing proudly in front of his Corsair. He had a look in his eyes that I recognized, a look of focus, determination, and a deep, abiding sense of purpose. It was the same look I saw in the mirror every morning. The letter was not an excuse. It was not a plea for forgiveness. It was a confession, a raw, painful admission of his own insecurities, his own failures, his own misguided pride. It didn't erase the years of neglect and casual cruelty, but it provided a context, a human dimension to the man who had caused me so much pain. For the first time, I saw my father not as a monster, but as a flawed, weak man who had let his own shortcomings poison his relationship with his daughter. I folded the letter and put it, along with the photograph, in my desk drawer. It didn't fix anything. It didn't magically heal the wounds or mend the shattered fragments of our family, but it was something, a flicker of understanding in a lifetime of darkness, a bittersweet acknowledgement of a truth that had been buried for far too long. I was my grandfather's legacy, and in my own way I had surpassed him. I was a captain now. 1 year later, I stood on the bridge of the USS Dauntless, the cold spray of the North Atlantic misting against the reinforced glass. The ship hummed beneath my feet, a living, breathing creature of steel and fire, and it was mine to command. My crew, a collection of the finest sailors in the Navy, moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency, their trust in me absolute. Out here, in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the ocean, there was no room for pretense or social games. There was only duty, honor, and the mission. My name was not Evelyn Wells, the disappointing daughter. It was Captain Wells, the commanding officer. It was a title I had earned, a name I had made for myself. My relationship with my family remained a fractured, distant thing. I spoke with my father occasionally, short, polite conversations that carefully avoided the minefield of the past. We would never be close, but there was a new, fragile respect between us, a shared understanding born from his one, honest letter. I had not spoken to my mother or Clara since the day I walked out of that wedding. The wound was too deep, the betrayal too profound. I had heard through my father that Clara's marriage to Marcus was strained, that the foundation of their relationship had been shaken by the events of that day. I felt a pang of sadness for them, but it was the detached sadness one feels for a stranger's misfortune. Their world was no longer my world. Sometimes, in the quiet solitude of the late-night watch, I would think of them. I would feel a ghost of the pain, a memory of the girl who had so desperately wanted her family's love. There was a part of me that would always mourn the loss of that dream, but the grief was no longer a storm that threatened to capsize me. It was a quiet current, deep and steady, a part of the ocean of my past. My victory had not been the moment the Admiral took my hand and exposed their cruelty. That was just the catalyst. My true victory was in the quiet moments that followed, in the decision to walk away, in the setting of boundaries, in the acceptance that I could not change them, but I could change how I allowed them to affect me. It was the bittersweet, hard-won peace that comes from choosing your own worth over the validation of others. I looked out at the endless horizon, where the gray sea met the gray sky. My ship cut through the waves, steady and relentless on a course I had set. I was the captain of this vessel, the master of my own fate, and I was finally truly free.